Hey there. Welcome to another hour where we slow down time together, where history becomes less about dramatic events and more about the small, repetitive actions that somehow built entire civilizations. Tonight we're talking about feasts, ancient Mesopotamian feasts. And I promise you, nothing about this story will get your heart racing. If anything, you'll drift off imagining the sound of grinding stones and the endless, patient preparation that turned grain into social order. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, what time it is there, and whether you're already in bed or just winding down your evening. Drop a comment if you feel like it. And if these slow historical journeys help you sleep, consider subscribing. We've got so many more tedious, wonderful stories to explore together. So, Mesopotamia. Around 3000 BCE, you're in Uruk, one of the world's first real cities. Not the biggest city by modern standards. Maybe 40,000 people. But 40,000 people living in one place was absolutely unprecedented in human history. For most of human existence, people lived in groups of maybe 100, maybe 200 maximum. Now there are 40,000 of you, all needing to eat every single day. And someone has to figure out how to make that happen. You wake up on the morning before a feast. Not a small family dinner. A communal feast. The temple is hosting. Your entire neighborhood is expected to attend. And by expected, I mean there's really no choice involved. Not attending would be social suicide. So you'll go. Obviously, you'll go. But first, someone has to make the food. Someone has to grind the grain. Someone has to brew the beer. Someone has to organize 40,000 people eating together without everything collapsing into chaos. Let's start with the grinding. Because the grinding is where everything begins. And the grinding is so slow. 3 women sit in a courtyard near your dwelling. They've been sitting there since before dawn, pushing grain between stones. Upper stone, lower stone. Push forward. The barley crushes a little. Pull back. Push again. It crushes a little more. They'll do this for hours. 4 hours of grinding produces enough flour for maybe 20 loaves of bread. This feast needs 200 loaves. Do the math. 40 hours of grinding, spread across multiple women, over multiple days. The sound is constant, a rhythmic scraping that becomes almost like silence after a while. Your brain learns to filter it out the way you filter out traffic noise or the hum of air conditioning. But it's always there. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The soundtrack of civilization, the sound of grain becoming flour, which will become bread, which will feed people, which will create the social bonds that hold cities together. You watch one of the women for a moment. Her name is Inanna, though not the goddess. Just a common woman with a common name. Her arms move in that repetitive rhythm. Forward, back, forward, back. Her face shows neither happiness nor sadness. Just the blank expression of someone doing work so repetitive that thinking about it would make it unbearable. So she doesn't think, she just moves her arms and lets her mind go somewhere else entirely. This is meditation. Really. Except instead of sitting peacefully on a cushion, you're grinding grain for hours until your shoulders ache and your hands develop calluses on top of calluses. But the mental state is similar. The repetition creates a kind of trance. The work continues without conscious effort. The pile of flour grows with glacial slowness. Imagine doing this. Imagine spending 4 hours of your day, every day, just grinding grain, not as punishment, not as penance, just as the ordinary work required to eat, because there's no mill, no machinery. No way to speed this up except by adding more people doing the same repetitive motion, hour after hour after hour. We complain when the microwave takes 3 minutes. These people spent 4 hours making enough flour for one day's bread. And they did it without complaining. Because complaining wouldn't make the grain grind itself. The work existed. The work had to be done. So they did it. While the grinding happens, other women are starting the beer. Because a Mesopotamian feast without beer isn't really a feast. It's just people sitting together eating bread and being sad. Beer is essential. Beer is currency. Beer is wages. Beer is offerings to gods. Beer is the social lubricant that makes sitting with your neighbors for hours somehow bearable. But making beer from barley takes at least a week. You can't rush it. You start by sprouting the grain, getting it damp, keeping it damp, letting it begin to germinate. The grain thinks it's going to become a plant. You let it believe this for 3 days. Then you interrupt its dreams by drying it, grinding it, and turning it into beer. After the malting comes the fermenting. You mix the malted barley with water and dates for sweetness. Then you wait. Yeast, wild yeast that lives everywhere in the air, needs to do its work. It needs to eat the sugars and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. This takes 3 to 4 days if you're lucky and the temperature is right. Longer if conditions aren't perfect. You cannot rush fermentation. You can pray to the gods for good results. People do pray for good beer, but you cannot make it go faster through willpower or impatience. Time passes. Yeast does its work. Eventually, you have beer. Or you have something that went wrong and now you have to start over and you've wasted a week of effort and expensive ingredients. The woman responsible for the beer at this feast is named Ninsun. She's been brewing for 20 years, since she was 14, and her mother taught her the craft. Ninsun knows by smell and taste when fermentation is proceeding correctly. She knows the difference between beer that will be merely adequate and beer that will make people smile when they drink it. This knowledge makes her valuable. This knowledge means she eats regularly from temple stores. This knowledge is power. In a world where power is often measured in who controls food and drink, Ninsun tastes the beer fermenting in large clay jars. She's testing for safety as much as quality. Bad beer can kill people. Bacterial contamination, toxins, organisms growing that produce substances deadly to humans. The taster puts her health at risk every time she samples fermenting beer. But someone has to do it. Someone has to verify that this beer won't poison the feast attendees. So Ninsun tastes, waits a few hours, and if she doesn't get sick, the beer is probably safe. Probably. It's not a perfect system, but it's the best system available in a world without microscopes or understanding of germs. While grain is being ground and beer is fermenting, other preparations proceed. Fish need to be caught. Not yesterday. Today, this morning, before the heat makes them spoil. Fishermen work the Euphrates before dawn, casting nets, pulling in catches, rushing them to the temple before decomposition begins. Fresh fish at a feast means someone stayed up all night fishing. Means coordination. Means labor that's invisible to everyone who will eat the fish and never think about the work required to get it from river to plate. Vegetables need gathering. Onions from storage. Lentils from storage. Dates from storage. Everything carefully stored in sealed vessels to keep out insects and rodents and the general decay that attacks food in this climate. Someone inventories the storage. Someone decides what to allocate for the feast. Someone physically moves heavy vessels from dark storage areas to preparation areas. More labor, more time, more coordination. And through all of this, the heat, the relentless, crushing heat that makes every physical task twice as exhausting. It's not yet noon, and already the temperature is climbing past comfortable into oppressive. The women grinding grain are sweating constantly. losing water and salt faster than they can replace them. But they keep working because the feast is coming and the feast must happen. The feast is obligation. The feast is expectation. The feast is the social contract that holds the city together. You don't skip feast preparation because you're hot. You work through the heat because that's what everyone does. What everyone has always done. What everyone will continue doing until the city itself ceases to exist. By mid-afternoon, the clay ovens are being loaded with fuel. Dried dung, mostly animal dung mixed with straw, formed into cakes, dried in the sun, burned as fuel because wood is scarce and expensive. The smell of burning dung becomes part of the smell of baking bread. You can't separate them. Bread equals dung, smoke equals the smell that fills neighborhoods on feast days. The ovens heat for hours. Too hot and bread burns outside while staying raw inside. Too cool and bread comes out dense and heavy. Just right requires constant attention. Constant adjustment of fuel and airflow. No thermometers. No temperature gauges. Just experience and the feeling of holding your hand near the opening and judging by instinct how hot it is inside. A woman named Kubaba manages the ovens today. She's been baking bread since she was a child. Learning from her grandmother. Learning from her mother. Learning through years of trial and error until she could tell by feeling alone when the oven was ready. Kubaba feeds fuel carefully. Checks heat constantly. Waits for the moment when everything is just right. Then, the bread goes in. Flat loaves. Because raised bread requires techniques these bakers haven't developed yet. The dough is slapped onto the inner walls of the oven where it sticks and bakes. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe 15 depending on thickness and heat. Then it's done. Golden brown. Aromatic? Ready. One loaf finished. 199 to go. The rhythm becomes meditative. Load bread. Wait. Remove bread. Load more bread. Wait. Remove bread. Over and over. For hours. Kubaba doesn't complain. Doesn't question why she's spending her entire day baking bread for a feast where she'll sit in the back, eat last. Receive the smallest portions. This is her role. This is what she does. The feast happens because she bakes the bread. Everyone knows this. Nobody says it out loud. As the sun finally begins its descent, as the temperature drops from unbearable to merely uncomfortable, the preparation reaches its culmination. Bread is baked, stacked, covered. Beer is tested one final time. Declared ready. Sealed in jars. Fish are preserved in salt to make it through the night. Vegetables are sorted and ready. Everything is prepared. Days of labor by dozens of people have produced the material foundation for a feast that will last a few hours. Hours of eating, of drinking, of social performance. All made possible by this invisible work. This is civilization. This is what cities do. They take the simple act of eating and make it so complicated that it requires professional administrators, specialized workers, detailed planning, and days of preparation. You lie down to sleep that night, knowing tomorrow you'll attend the feast. You'll sit where you're told. You'll eat what you're given. You'll perform the social rituals expected of you. Because everyone does this. Because the alternative is exile, is being cut off from the social networks that make survival possible. As you drift towards sleep, you hear, faintly, the grinding stones. Someone is still working, still grinding grain, because there's always more grain to grind, more bread to make, more feasts to prepare for. The work never ends. The obligations never cease. Morning arrives not gently but insistently. The sun doesn't ease into the sky here. It climbs fast and hot. announcing its presence before you've fully opened your eyes. You've been awake for a while already, lying still, reluctant to begin the day, because beginning the day means attending the feast. You rise because everyone rises. Because staying home isn't an option. The woman who doesn't attend the temple feast, that story would be told and retold until it became your identity, eclipsing everything else about you. So you rise. You dress. You prepare to spend hours performing the social obligations that make urban life possible. The courtyard where the feast will be held is already filling when you arrive. Not because you're late. You're actually early, arriving as the sun is still low. But others are earlier still. The most punctual, the most eager, or perhaps just the most anxious about securing good positions. They're already here, standing in loose groups, making small talk that fills time without requiring actual communication. You take your place. Not just anywhere. There's a geography to this gathering, an invisible map of who stands near whom. Family groups cluster together. Neighbors form loose associations. And carefully, very carefully, people maintain distance from those they're in conflict with. Not obvious distance. That would be insulting. But enough space that they won't be forced into conversation. You watch people arriving. This is seeing social structure made visible through the simple act of people choosing where to stand. The wealthy merchants arrive and immediately command space. Temple officials enter and the crowd parts. Not dramatically, but through dozens of small adjustments as people step back slightly, creating paths without being asked. Children run, briefly, before parents catch them with sharp whispers about appropriate behavior. This isn't a playground. This is serious. This is where reputations are maintained or destroyed. So children are grabbed, corrected, told to stand still and be quiet and watch the adults to learn how proper people behave. The waiting begins. The feast doesn't start when the food is ready. Everyone knows the food is ready. You can smell it. Bread, fish, the yeasty tang of beer being opened. But the feast starts when the appropriate official decides the appropriate moment has arrived. This could be minutes from now. Could be hours. Nobody knows. Everyone waits. This waiting isn't passive. It's active social work. You make eye contact with people you know. Nod acknowledgement. Occasionally exchange a few words. You very carefully don't make eye contact with people you're avoiding. You watch to see who arrives together, who seeks each other out, who maintains distance despite being in the same social circles. A man you know slightly moves closer to you. A merchant who trades in dates and honey, not right next to you. That would be presumptuous, but close enough that conversation is possible. He comments on the weather, which is hot, like it's always hot. You agree that yes, it's hot. This is small talk elevated to art form. You're not talking about weather. You're establishing that you're willing to be seen talking to each other, that you're not enemies, that minimal social relations exist between your families. More people arrive. The courtyard fills. 40, 50, 60 people. Maybe more. The density increases. Personal space shrinks. The excitement of arrival fades into the tedium of waiting. People shift their weight from foot to foot, fan themselves with whatever's available. But nobody complains. Complaining would mark you as impatient, as disrespectful, as someone who prioritizes comfort over communal obligation. So you stand. You sweat. You wait. Finally, movement at the front. A priest emerges from the temple proper, dressed in ceremonial garments, carrying a vessel, the expensive one, the one reserved for ritual use. This is the libation vessel. This is how the feast will begin. Not with eating, but with offering. The crowd quiets immediately. Chattering stops. Parents grab children more firmly. Everyone turns attention to the priest. He stands at the small altar, raises the vessel, and begins to chant. In Sumerian, which is ancient even now, a liturgical language that few people understand conversationally, but everyone recognizes as sacred language. The words wash over you. You don't understand them. Not really. You know this is a hymn to Inanna, goddess of fertility and war, and apparently also feasts. The priest is invoking her, asking her blessing, offering her the first portion. He pours beer from the vessel onto the ground. Expensive beer. Beer that cost 3 days of labor to make. It soaks into the earth in seconds. The goddess has received her portion, or the ground has absorbed beer while everyone pretends. Either way, the ritual is complete. But wait, there's more ritual first. Because of course there is. A priest brings forward a loaf of bread. Special bread, made with the finest flour, baked in a special mold. This bread took 8 hours to make. 8 hours for one loaf. And it's being placed before a statue of Inanna, gold-plated, wearing elaborate jewelry. Everyone bows. You bow. You watch the statue. The statue does not eat the bread. This doesn't surprise anyone. But the ritual requires the offering. The bread will sit there for the duration of the feast. Then later, much later, priests will consume it. Because food offered to gods can't be wasted. The waiting continues. But now with different quality. Now you're waiting not for the feast to begin, but for your turn to eat. Because eating doesn't happen all at once. Eating happens in waves. In carefully orchestrated order. In a sequence that makes visible the entire social hierarchy. The priests eat first. This surprises no one. They seat themselves on actual chairs. Chairs are expensive. Are marks of status. Servants bring them food. Meat, roasted goat, the smell making your mouth water. White bread, soft and light. Date, wine. Expensive and strong. They eat slowly, not because the food is too hot, but because eating slowly is dignified. Rushing would be undignified, would suggest they're peasants who don't know better. So they eat with deliberate slowness, taking small bites, pausing between mouthfuls, conducting quiet conversations, performing their status through unhurried consumption. You watch this. Everyone watches this. This is part of the feast. Watching hierarchy made visible through food distribution. You're not resentful. Exactly. This is how things work. This is how things have always worked. Priests eat first and best. That's the official story. Whether you believe it or question it quietly, if you keep that to yourself, the second wave begins. Skilled workers, scribes, master potters, successful merchants. They're called forward in small groups. They don't get chairs. They sit on woven reed mats. They receive portions noticeably smaller than the priests. Same types of food, but less of it. The message is clear: you're important. You're valued. You're just not that important. They eat. You watch. More waiting. You're hungry now. Actually hungry. Because you skipped breakfast knowing you'd eat at the feast. Watching other people eat while you stand and wait activates every instinct that says food, want food, need food. You control yourself. Everyone controls themselves. Showing hunger-driven impatience would be terrible breach of proper behavior. The third wave. This is where you are. The broad middle of society. People who work but aren't enslaved. People who own small amounts of property. The majority. You're called forward. You sit on the ground. No mats. The ground is hard, is dirty, is uncomfortable. You sit anyway, because sitting means you're about to eat. Finally, after hours of standing and waiting, around you, your neighbors do the same. Family groups stay together, maintaining identity even in mass seating. Food arrives, not individually served, but set out in communal vessels. Large bowls of lentil stew, thick with onions and garlic. Bread, good bread, brown bread, warm, delicious. Beer, plenty of beer, in large jars with long reed straws. And fish, not the choicest cuts, but fish nonetheless. Protein, flavor. The fish is salty from preservation. A bit tough from being caught yesterday rather than this morning. But it's fish. It's food. And you're hungry enough that it tastes wonderful. You eat with your hands. There are no utensils. Forks won't be invented for thousands of years. You tear bread. Use it to scoop lentils. Grab chunks of fish with fingers that will be oily and sticky for hours. Everyone around you does the same. This is normal. This is how humans eat. The pace is different here than in higher waves. People eat faster, more eagerly, with less performance of dignity. Not rushing exactly, but not dawdling. You eat steadily, filling your belly with bread and lentils and beer. The beer is good, better than expected. Whoever brewed this batch knew what they were doing. It's smooth, slightly sweet from dates, with that distinctive barley flavor. Around you, conversations begin. News is exchanged. Information flows. A man mentions that the irrigation canal needs repair. Several people respond with observations about water flow, about whether the temple will allocate labor. This seems mundane, but this is information exchange in a world without newspapers. This is how people learn who's reliable, who pays debts, who holds grudges. A woman discusses her daughter's upcoming marriage, not gossiping. Sharing information that redraws social maps. Her daughter is marrying into a potter's family. This creates alliance. Future trades become easier. This marriage announcement, delivered casually while eating fish, has implications that will ripple through the community for years. You contribute little. You listen more than speak. Still learning the social landscape. Every feast is education. Is data collection. Is slow accumulation of social knowledge. The beer jars circulate. You don't drink from individual cups. Everyone shares. Long reed straws stick out of jars. And people take turns drinking. You put your mouth where other mouths have been. You share saliva. Share whatever illnesses might circulate. Share the intimate act of drawing liquid from the same source. This isn't unhygienic by local standards. This is community. This is trust made physical. You drink deeply. The beer makes the heat slightly more bearable. The hard ground slightly more comfortable. Your neighbors slightly more interesting. You understand why beer is central to feasts. It doesn't just provide calories. It provides social lubrication that makes hours of sitting with the same people endurable. More food appears. Not because you're still hungry, but because the feast has to dispose of prepared food. Waste would be unthinkable. So additional bread is brought out. More fish. More stew. People eat more slowly now, picking rather than devouring, but still eating because the food is there, and refusing would be insulting. The eating continues. The afternoon wears on. The heat intensifies, then slowly begins to fade. People are still eating, still talking, but the energy is changing. The initial excitement has passed. The hunger has been satisfied. Now it's just the long middle, where you're neither eager to stay nor quite ready to leave. And the appropriateness of departure is determined by hierarchy. Important people will leave first. Their departure signals that the feast is winding down. Only after they've gone can people of your status begin to leave. So you wait. Again? Still. Waiting to arrive. Waiting to start. Waiting to eat. And now waiting for permission to go home. As the sun touches the horizon, the priests stand. They're leaving. They've fulfilled their role. Their departure creates a cascade. Second-tier people stand shortly after. Then your group begins to rise. Stretching legs. Gathering yourselves. You don't just walk away. You have to acknowledge the host. You approach. You bow slightly. You express gratitude in formal phrases everyone uses. The priest nods, accepts your thanks. You've attended. You've eaten. You've shown proper respect. The social contract has been honored. The walk home feels longer than the walk there. You're full. Almost uncomfortably full. Bloated with bread and lentils and beer. Your fingers are still sticky. Your back aches from sitting on hard ground for hours. You're exhausted from constant social awareness. Constant performance. But you're also satisfied in a way that has nothing to do with food. You've participated. You've been seen participating. You've been recorded as present. For the next few months, you can relax slightly. You've fulfilled this obligation. You've paid this social debt. The evening air is cooler now. Almost pleasant. The city is quieter. People returning to homes. You pass others from the feast. Exchange nods. Maintain connections that were reinforced today. Tomorrow you'll wake, and the memory of fullness will be fading. Tomorrow there will be work. But tonight, you're fed. Tonight, you're connected. Tonight, you're part of something larger than yourself. And in a few months, you'll do it all again. You wake the morning after the feast with a headache. Not terrible, but persistent. A dull ache behind your eyes that reminds you that you drank more beer yesterday than your body typically processes. The beer was good. The beer was plentiful. The beer is now making you regret decisions between the fourth and seventh jar. But this is normal. This is expected consequence of proper feast attendance. If you don't have a mild headache the next morning, you probably didn't drink enough beer to be properly sociable. The city around you is quieter than usual. Other people experiencing similar sensations. Work will happen today because work always happens. But work will happen more slowly, with more breaks, with less enthusiasm. You think about yesterday's feast as you move through morning routines. Not just the eating, but the rituals embedded within eating. The moments when consumption stopped being merely practical and became something else. Something sacred. Something that connected you not just to neighbors but to forces beyond human control. At some point during the feast, eating had stopped being just eating. You're not sure exactly when. The transition was subtle, but you remember becoming aware of it. A priest had stood. The crowd had quieted instantly. You'd been chewing bread, and you'd stopped chewing. Held the bread in your mouth. Waiting. The priest had begun to chant. Not in everyday Akkadian. In Sumerian, ancient Sumerian. The language of the old gods. The language that was already ancient when your grandparents were young. Nobody speaks it conversationally anymore, but everyone recognizes it as the tongue of the divine. You didn't understand the words. Not individually. But you understood the context. This was a hymn to Inanna, the great goddess, queen of heaven, mistress of fertility and warfare, and apparently communal feasts. The goddess whose favor determines whether the city prospers or collapses. The priest's voice rose and fell in patterns that felt ancient, that felt rehearsed over centuries. that felt like they connected directly to something fundamental about being human in this place. You didn't need to understand the words. You needed to feel the weight of them. The seriousness. The connection to forces beyond the immediate. Everyone had bowed their heads. You'd bowed yours. Some people seemed genuinely moved. Their eyes closed. Their faces composed in expressions of reverence that looked real rather than performed. Other people maintained appropriate, respectful postures while their eyes stayed alert, watching the crowd, thinking about practical concerns beneath the veneer of piety. You'd been somewhere in between, not deeply spiritual, not coldly calculating, just present, participating in ritual larger than any individual's belief or disbelief. The ritual worked not because everyone believed it, but because everyone performed it. The performance itself was the power. This is religion. You'd thought, this is how it actually functions. Not through individual conviction necessarily, but through collective participation, through agreement that yes, we will all bow our heads when the priest chants. We will all maintain silence during sacred moments. We will all perform reverence regardless of private thoughts. And through that collective performance, something emerges. Call it social cohesion. Call it divine favor. Call it whatever you want. But something happens when 40 people simultaneously agree to treat a moment as sacred. Now, the morning after, you think about the foods that carry sacred significance. The foods that aren't just nutrition but symbol. Meaning, connection to cosmic order. Dates. For instance, you'd eaten dates yesterday. Sweet and sticky. A luxury that most people access only at feasts. Dates are sacred because date palms take 7 years to fruit. 7 years. Think about that. You plant a sapling and you wait. You water it. Protect it. Maintain it through seasons and years. Only after 7 full cycles does the palm finally produce fruit. This makes dates inherently sacred. This makes them metaphors for everything good that requires patience. The date palms themselves are called the tree of life in hymns. They provide not just fruit, but wood, bronze for weaving, fiber for rope, shade for smaller plants. They're the foundation of survival here, and they take 7 years to establish. 7 years of faith that yes, this investment will pay off. Eating dates at the feast wasn't just eating sweets. It was consuming concentrated patience. It was participating in a cycle of growth and harvest that spans years. Every date is a prayer to patience. Every bite is acknowledgement that good things come to those who wait. Barley carries sacred weight for different reasons. Barley is fast. Single season. Plant in autumn. Harvest in spring. But barley is sacred because it's the reason cities exist. Barley grows here when wheat won't. Barley tolerates the heat, the salt in soil, the irregular flooding. Barley is reliable. Wheat is better. Everyone agrees. Wheat makes lighter bread. Softer bread, but wheat is picky. Wheat demands conditions Mesopotamia can't consistently provide. So barley it is. Barley bread. Barley beer. Barley as foundation of everything. You're not eating bread when you eat barley bread. You're consuming compressed civilization. You're eating the grain that made cities possible, that allowed 40,000 people to live in one place, that created agricultural surplus, that freed some people to become priests and scribes instead of everyone being farmers. The fish you ate carried its own significance. Fish from the Tigris and Euphrates, the twin rivers that define this land. Fish are abundance made visible. Fish require no planting, no cultivation, no harvest labor. They simply exist in the rivers. Free food for anyone with nets and time. Fresh fish at a feast signals that the host has connections. has access to fishermen willing to wake before dawn, has the labor network to transport fish quickly before heat causes spoilage, has the social capital to ensure delivery on the specific day needed. You're not eating fish. You're consuming political networks. You're ingesting the web of relationships that makes fresh fish appear at the right moment. At some point during the feast, you'd notice priests examining bread, not eating it, examining it. They'd broken loaves in half, studied the interior texture, the way crust had formed, the pattern of air pockets. They'd been reading omens, divination through baked goods, the future revealed in carbohydrates. This practice strikes you as slightly absurd, though you'd never say so aloud. The idea that how bread bakes can reveal cosmic truths seems optimistic. But the priests take it seriously. They examine bread with intense concentration, noting which loaves have good cracks, which are too dense, which baked unevenly. Good cracks mean good fortune. Dense crumb means obstacles ahead. Uneven baking suggests social discord. Perfect bread indicates divine approval. The bread looked fine to you. The bread always looks fine. It's bread. It baked. It's edible. But apparently there are subtleties invisible to untrained eyes. The priests see patterns, meanings, messages from gods embedded in the very structure of bread. Or they claim to. Or they've convinced themselves they do. Or they're maintaining a tradition that gives them interpretive authority over random events, allowing them to frame whatever happens as predicted, foreseen, aligned with cosmic will. The war everyone knows is coming will happen regardless of bread texture, but everyone feels better having consulted the bread, having performed the ritual of seeking divine guidance. The bread prophecy will be ambiguous enough to fit whatever outcome occurs. The prophecy adapts to results. This is how divination maintains credibility despite having no actual predictive power. Throughout the feast, there had been music. You'd barely noticed at first. So focused on social navigation and food and hierarchy. But music had been playing constantly. A lyre player, seated near the priests, playing songs that were probably ancient, probably traditional, probably the same songs played at every feast for generations. The melodies were familiar in that way. Things become familiar through repetition, even if you couldn't hum them accurately. The songs were about gods, about heroes, about proper behavior and cosmic order, about Gilgamesh and his quest for immortality, about Inanna's descent to the underworld, stories told through music, preserved through performance. Nobody was really listening. Everyone was eating, talking, conducting social business. But the music mattered. Its presence mattered. Silence during a feast would have been deeply uncomfortable, would have made every conversation too audible. The music filled space, made conversation easier, provided rhythm without demanding attention. The musician was a professional, temple employee, trained since childhood, fed from temple stores in exchange for this service. His job was to make feasts feel sacred, to create atmospheric holiness through sound, to transform ordinary eating into ceremony through addition of ancient melodies. He was good at it. The lyre sounded beautiful, its tones pure and clear. You wouldn't remember the melodies this morning. Nobody would. The music was designed not to be memorable, but to be appropriate, to set a mood, to fill silence, to signal that this was a proper feast with proper observances. Children had been present at the feast, though you'd barely noticed them. But they'd been there, sitting with families, watching everything, absorbing unspoken rules through observation rather than instruction. This was education. This was how social structures transmitted themselves across generations. They learned who sat where, who spoke to whom, who received honored portions and who ate last. They learned that patience was expected, that grabbing was shameful, that behavior reflected on entire families. They learned that silence during sacred moments was mandatory, that respect for priests was automatic. One child had run between seated groups. You'd seen it. A child, maybe 5 years old, had broken free and sprinted through the crowd. Laughing, delighting in movement, the parent had reacted instantly. Not with violence, not with shouting, but with firm correction. The child had been grabbed, pulled back, spoken to in sharp whispers. The child's face had crumpled. The joy had evaporated. The lesson had been learned. The lesson wasn't that running is dangerous. The lesson was that disrupting the feast's order was social offense. That individual impulses don't matter when communal cohesion is at stake. That your desires are subordinate to group functioning. Harsh, maybe. By modern standards, definitely harsh. But effective. Undeniably effective. These children would grow up knowing exactly how society worked. Knowing their place, knowing the rules. The children had received smaller portions than adults. Not equal shares despite equal hunger. They hadn't contributed labor. They weren't full members yet. So they received enough to not be hungry, but not enough to be full. They received lessons in delayed gratification. In earning your place, you'd watched a young girl, maybe 8, accept her small portion without complaint. She'd eaten slowly, making it last. Watching adults receive larger portions with an expression you couldn't quite read. Acceptance, resentment, understanding that someday she'd be an adult receiving full portions. All of those probably mixed together. She was learning that life wasn't fair in any abstract sense. Learning that you got what your social position entitled you to receive. Learning that patience and conformity eventually resulted in advancement through the hierarchy if you lived long enough and performed properly. As the morning after the feast continues, you think about what the feast actually was. Not just eating, not just social gathering, but complex performance where sacred and mundane intertwined so completely that separating them became impossible. You'd eaten bread and fish. You'd also consumed hierarchy, participated in religious ritual, demonstrated social compliance, renewed communal bonds, and transmitted cultural values to the next generation. The feast was theater, was education, was religion, was politics, was all of these simultaneously, none quite separable from the others. You'd performed your role adequately, not brilliantly. You weren't trying to stand out, but adequately. You'd shown up, eaten appropriately, maintained proper demeanor, acknowledged your place. You'd done what was expected, which was exactly what was expected. In a few months, there would be another feast. Different occasion maybe. Different foods possibly. But same fundamental structure. Same hierarchy made visible through food distribution. Same rituals embedded in eating. Same children watching and learning. Same performance of community. This was civilization. Not the monuments or laws, but this, the feast, the gathering, the slow conversion of food into meaning, the patient construction of social order through thousands of meals where people sat together and ate together and agreed, tacitly, that yes, this is how things are done. The grinding stones fall silent for a moment, then start again. Someone has ground enough flour. For now, tomorrow the work begins again. 3 days after the feast, you're called to witness a dispute. Not formally, not with any legal summons, but word spreads through your neighborhood that 2 men are bringing their conflict before the community. And your presence is expected. Not optional. Expected. Because disputes in Mesopotamian cities aren't resolved behind closed doors. They're resolved publicly. in front of witnesses, where everyone can see and hear and judge and remember. The dispute is mundane enough. A property boundary issue. Two neighbors who share a wall disagree about where exactly that boundary lies. One claims the other has encroached by building a storage room that extends 6 inches past the proper line. The other insists the boundary has always been where it currently is, that no encroachment occurred. 6 inches. That's what this is about. 6 inches of mud brick wall. And everyone is taking it seriously. Because property is fundamental. Because boundaries matter. Because if you let one person shift a boundary by 6 inches without challenge, soon everyone's boundaries become negotiable. And property itself becomes meaningless. The hearing will take place at the next communal meal. Not a major feast, but a smaller neighborhood gathering. The kind that happens monthly, where 30 or 40 families come together for an evening meal and to handle collective business. The feast becomes the courthouse. The meal becomes the trial. When the evening arrives, you walk to the neighborhood gathering place, a courtyard shared by several extended families, large enough to accommodate the expected crowd. The smell of cooking fish reaches you before you see the gathering. Someone grilling fish over open coals. The smoke and aroma announcing that food is ready. The courtyard is already full. People sit in their usual family groups. But there's a different energy tonight. Quieter. More alert. Everyone knows about the dispute. Everyone has opinions. The two men in conflict are both present. Sitting with respective families. Maintaining careful distance. Neither looks happy. Both look resigned. The meal begins with usual rituals. Brief prayers. Symbolic offerings. Acknowledgement of gods who watch over neighborhood gatherings. Then, food is distributed. Not in waves based on status like at temple feasts, but in rough order of age and family importance. Elders eat first. Large families receive generous portions. You eat slowly. The fried fish greasy and delicious. The bread warm. Around you, people eat and talk in low voices, discussing the dispute, taking sides, forming opinions. This isn't random gossip. This is the community forming consensus before formal proceedings begin. When most people have finished eating, when immediate hunger has been satisfied, one of the neighborhood elders stands. He's old, maybe 70, which is extraordinary here. His survival to this age gives him authority. He's seen disputes before. He knows how this works. He calls the two disputants forward. They stand, reluctantly, and approach the center. Everyone else forms a rough circle around them, creating an arena. There's no judge in the formal sense, but there are witnesses. Everyone here is a witness, and whatever resolution emerges will carry the weight of community consensus. The elder asks the first man to state his case. The man does so, speaking clearly, trying to control emotion. He explains that he's lived in his compound for 20 years, that the boundary wall has always stood in a specific location. That last month, his neighbor began construction on a storage room. That the new construction extends past the traditional boundary by approximately 6 inches. That he asked his neighbor to correct this. That his neighbor refused. That he now brings the matter before the community. His presentation is simple, factual, designed to make his position seem reasonable and his neighbor's behavior seem unreasonable. He's not yelling. He's not making dramatic accusations. He's just explaining. This is how you present disputes. Calmly, factually, with respect for collective judgment. The second man responds. He tells a different story. He agrees that construction occurred. He agrees that a storage room was built. But he insists the boundary has always been ambiguous, that the exact location has never been formally established, that his construction falls well within what he believes to be his legitimate property. He suggests his neighbor is making trouble over nothing, that 6 inches shouldn't matter, that neighbors should work out minor differences without involving the entire community. The two accounts contradict each other. Both men speak calmly. Both present themselves as reasonable people dealing with an unreasonable neighbor. You watch and listen and realize that truth, in the objective sense of what actually happened, is almost irrelevant. What matters is which story the community finds more convincing. Which man presents himself better? The elder asks if anyone has information relevant to the case. This is when witnesses speak, when neighbors who've observed the situation offer perspectives. Several people respond. An old woman who lives nearby says she remembers when both compounds were first built. Says she's certain the boundary has always been where the first man claims. A younger man supports the second disputant. Says he helped with storage room construction. Says they were careful to stay on the right side. The testimonies contradict each other. The witnesses are describing the same physical reality but interpreting it differently, or remembering differently, or possibly lying to support neighbors they're allied with. You can't tell which. Maybe all simultaneously. Memory is unreliable. Self-interest shapes perception. Social bonds influence testimony. More people speak. Some offer direct observations about the boundary. Others talk about the character of the disputants. He's always been fair. Someone says about the first man, he helped my family during the harvest failure. Someone else says about the second man, the dispute about 6 inches becomes a referendum on entire social standing. Their reputations are being assessed publicly. Their past behaviors weighed. You say nothing. You're too new to have relevant information. Too marginal to have an opinion that matters. But you're expected to be present. Expected to witness. Expected to participate in collective judgment, even if your participation is mostly silent observation. The discussion continues for what feels like hours, but is probably 30 or 40 minutes. People eat while they talk. Beer jars circulating, keeping the atmosphere from becoming too tense. Part trial, part dinner party, part community meeting. Finally, the elders confer among themselves. 3 old men, heads together, speaking in low voices, weighing testimonies, considering characters, calculating what resolution will satisfy the most people and create the least ongoing resentment. The eldest speaks. His judgment is that the boundary should be formally marked in a way that splits the disputed distance. 3 inches each side. Neither man gets everything he wanted. Both men lose something, but the loss is equal. Is fair in the sense that both suffer the same small defeat. The elder explains that neighbors must live beside each other for years, probably for life, and maintaining peace is more important than winning disputes. 3 inches each side. The boundary will be formally marked with stones set in ground where everyone can see them. The decision is made. Both men nod acceptance. Neither looks happy, but both understand that fighting the judgment would be worse than accepting it, would mark them as troublemakers. They agree to the boundary marking. They agree to split the cost of stones. They agree. Basically, because the alternative is social death. The gathering applauds lightly, not celebrating victory but acknowledging that resolution has been reached, that the process worked, that the community successfully negotiated conflict without violence, without permanent rupture. This is success, not because justice was perfectly achieved, but because peace was preserved. The meal continues. People eat more fish, drink more beer, discuss other matters. The dispute fades into general noise of community life. In a few days, the boundary stones will be set. In a few months, most people will forget the specifics. But the memory that disputes can be resolved through communal meals, through public discussion, through collective judgment. that memory remains. Later in the evening, you observe another kind of negotiation. Two families sitting near each other. Not by accident. They're discussing marriage. Not formally. Not yet. But exploring possibilities. The families have a son and a daughter of appropriate ages. Compatible in status and resources. A marriage would benefit both sides. Creating alliance. Pooling resources. Establishing kinship. Where previously there was only neighborly connection. The discussion happens in low voices. Casual seeming. Embedded in general socializing. But everyone nearby is aware. Everyone watches peripherally while pretending not to. Because this negotiation, if successful, will reorganize social relationships throughout the neighborhood. The families are assessing each other. Not just wealth. Though wealth matters, they're evaluating behavior. How does this family conduct itself at gatherings? Are they generous? Do they honor obligations? How do they treat lower status neighbors? Do they drink too much and become problems? Are they reliable? You watch the parents watching each other while they eat. The conversation is about farming, about irrigation schedules, about mundane topics. But underneath the surface talk, evaluation is happening. Both sides are performing competence. Demonstrating worthiness, showing that their family would be a good addition to the other family's social network. The young man and young woman in question sit quietly nearby, knowing they're the objects of negotiation but having no voice in the process. Their preferences, their attractions, their desires. These are irrelevant, or at least secondary. Marriage isn't about individual happiness. Marriage is alliance, is strategy, is merging of family resources and obligations. The young people will marry who their families decide they'll marry. And probably they'll be fine. Probably they'll develop affection over years of shared life. Or at least functional cooperation. Which is close enough. You think about your own potential marriage prospects. If you stay in this city long enough to establish yourself, these feasts are where such negotiations happen, where families assess each other, where alliances are formed through careful observation and even more careful performance. You're being evaluated constantly, even when you're not aware of it. As the evening deepens and the meal gradually transitions into the dispersal phase, you think about what you've witnessed. Dispute resolution through dinner. Marriage negotiations over fish. The feast isn't just a meal. The feast is the operating system of urban society. The platform where all the important business of collective life gets conducted. Court systems exist. Formal procedures with judges and written codes. But those are for serious crimes. For everyday disputes. For the constant small conflicts that arise when 40,000 people live together. The feast serves as courthouse. The meal serves as legal procedure. Community consensus serves as verdict. This system works because everyone knows they'll face judgment eventually. Everyone knows their behavior is being observed. Everyone knows that today's witness might be tomorrow's disputant. You walk home through darkening streets. The evening was exhausting in that particular way, that social obligations are exhausting. Your mind is tired from constant awareness. Constant performance, constant navigation of social complexity. But you're also satisfied. You witnessed justice. Of a sort. You saw community functioning. You observed the mechanisms that hold a neighborhood together, that prevent every boundary dispute from escalating into violence. In a few months, there will be another gathering. Maybe you'll have a dispute to bring forward. Maybe you'll be a witness. Maybe you'll be one of the families being evaluated as potential marriage allies. You'll participate in the feast, in the meal, in the ongoing social performance. The cycle continues. The feast happens. The judgments are made. The marriages are negotiated. The obligations accumulate. And through it all, the city holds together. 2 weeks after the neighborhood feast where you witnessed the boundary dispute. You're called upon to fulfill an obligation you didn't realize you'd incurred. A neighbor, someone you barely know beyond nodding acknowledgement in the street, appears at your dwelling in the morning. She explains that her family is hosting a small gathering. Nothing major. Just a meal for their daughter's coming-of-age ceremony. Your presence would honor them. Your attendance would be appreciated. This is not an invitation. This is a summons. This is the obligation economy in action. You attended the neighborhood feast 2 weeks ago. You ate food provided by the collective. You witnessed the dispute resolution. You participated in communal life. And now participation demands reciprocation. You must attend this family's gathering. Must witness their ceremony. Must eat their food, and thereby acknowledge your ongoing membership in the social network. You agree. Of course. There's no other acceptable response. Refusing would mark you as antisocial, as someone who takes from the community without giving back. So you smile, you express gratitude for the invitation that isn't really an invitation, and you promise to attend. The woman nods, satisfied, and moves on to notify the next household on her list. This is how it works. This is the aftermath of every feast. The obligations created don't disappear when the meal ends. They ripple outward, creating networks of debt and duty that can be called in at any time, that accumulate over years, that eventually become so complex that nobody can fully track who owes what to whom. You just know that participating in community meals creates obligations, and those obligations must be honored. You spend the day thinking about these obligations, about the invisible web of social debt you've been accumulating. Every feast attended is debt incurred. Every shared meal is investment in social capital that may or may not pay dividends later. You're building a reputation, slowly, through attendance and appropriate behavior. But you're also becoming entangled in networks you don't fully understand. This is the price of civilization. This is what it costs to be part of a community. Your time is no longer fully your own. Your calendar is determined partly by your needs and partly by social obligations that others can invoke. You attend because you must attend. You participate because participation is mandatory. The evening of the coming-of-age feast arrives. You walk through streets now familiar, toward a family compound you've never entered. The smell of cooking food guides you. Lamb. You think someone is roasting lamb, which is expensive, which signals that this family is spending considerable resources on their daughter's ceremony. The gathering is smaller than the neighborhood feast, maybe 20 families, perhaps 30 people total. Intimate by feast standards, though still large enough to be public, to have witnesses, to create the sense of communal participation that validates the ceremony. The daughter being honored stands near her mother, looking uncomfortable in ceremonial clothing, probably wishing this would be over quickly, but understanding that suffering through public attention is part of becoming an adult. She's 13, which makes her an adult by local standards. Old enough to marry, to work full adult labor, to participate in decision-making. The ceremony marks this transition, makes it public, creates witnesses. Food is distributed. The lamb is indeed lamb, roasted carefully, seasoned with expensive herbs. The family is demonstrating their resources, showing they can afford quality food, sending signals about their status and their daughter's marriage prospects. This isn't just feeding people. This is advertising. You eat slowly, the lamb tender and flavorful, better than anything you've eaten in weeks. The family's investment in this meal is substantial, probably represents savings accumulated over months. They're buying something with this meal, buying reputation, buying status, buying the obligation that everyone here now owes them. The girl's father stands and speaks. Not long. Speeches at these gatherings are brief. He thanks everyone for attending. He expresses hope that his daughter will grow into a respected woman, will marry well, will bring honor to her family. He asks the community to witness that his daughter is now an adult, to remember this moment, to treat her accordingly. Everyone murmurs approval. Everyone eats. The ceremony is complete. A girl has become a woman through the simple act of declaring it so, in front of witnesses, while providing lamb and bread and beer. The biological reality is irrelevant. What matters is the social recognition, the public acknowledgement, the collective agreement. As eating continues, conversations drift to other topics: irrigation and flooding, harvest prospects, temple politics, family alliances. Nobody discusses the girl directly. That would be impolite now that she's an adult. But people discuss marriage prospects in general. The girl's availability is advertised through absence of mention. You watch the social machinery operate. Families with sons of appropriate age note this new availability. Families with daughters being honored at similar ceremonies observe how this one was conducted. Everything is data. Everything feeds into complex calculations of marriage strategy. The meal extends through evening. The family must demonstrate that they can afford to feed people for several hours. Leaving too quickly would suggest boredom. Staying too long would suggest taking advantage. There's a window, invisible but real, when departure becomes appropriate. You watch for signals. Follow leads. Leave when higher status attendees leave. As you walk home through complete darkness, you think about the obligations you've created tonight. You ate this family's lamb. You witnessed their daughter's coming of age. You participated in making her adult status socially real. They can now call on you for reciprocation. This is how the web grows. This is how networks form. One meal at a time. One small obligation at a time. Until everyone in the city is connected through chains of debt and duty that stretch back months or years. You can't trace all the connections, but you know they exist. The next morning, you wake thinking about failure, about what happens when feasts go wrong, when obligations aren't met or hospitality is insufficient. You've heard stories. Every neighborhood has stories about feasts that went wrong. There's the family 3 districts over where the beer ran out. A major feast. Dozens of families invited. And the host had miscalculated. Halfway through the evening, the beer supply was exhausted. People went home thirsty, insulted, angry. That was 10 years ago. People still talk about it. That family never recovered. Their children have difficulty finding marriage partners. They're excluded from important gatherings. One failed feast destroyed their social standing for a generation. Or the merchant who served spoiled fish. Not intentionally. Something had gone wrong with preservation. Half the guests became violently ill. Nobody died. But the reputation damage was catastrophic. Nobody trusts his hospitality now. His business has suffered accordingly. These stories circulate as warnings, as reminders that feasts are serious business, that stakes are high, that failure isn't just embarrassing, but potentially catastrophic. You prepare for feasts with genuine anxiety, knowing that your entire social standing rides on having enough food, on the beer being good, on nothing spoiling. This is why feast preparation takes days. Why people obsess over details. Why quality control is paranoid and excessive. Because the cost of failure is too high. Because one bad feast can erase years of careful reputation building. You think about your own eventual feast. Whenever that might be. You'll need to host eventually. Reciprocity demands it. All these meals you're attending, all these obligations you're incurring, they'll need to be repaid. This thought creates anxiety. How will you afford it? How will you calculate quantities correctly? How will you avoid becoming one of those cautionary tales? But you also think about what survives. About elements of Mesopotamian feast culture that will persist long after this civilization collapses. The communal meal as social technology, as platform for conducting civic business, as mechanism for creating obligations. This survives. Church potlucks, where community members bring dishes, where social bonds are reinforced through eating together. These are Mesopotamian feasts, stripped of explicit religious ritual but maintaining the same social function. Thanksgiving dinners where extended families gather, where hierarchies are performed through seating arrangements, where younger generations watch and learn, where hosts take on enormous stress, obsessing over having enough food, knowing that failure will be remembered. This is Mesopotamian feast anxiety transported thousands of years into the future. Company picnics and office parties where attendance is technically optional but actually mandatory, where not attending marks you as antisocial and damages career prospects. These are feast obligations in corporate form. Neighborhood barbecues where residents gather, where the quality of your contribution gets noticed and remembered, where disputes get addressed informally, where alliances form. Mesopotamian neighborhood feasts. Renamed but not fundamentally changed. The Mesopotamians didn't invent communal eating. Humans have been eating together since before humans were humans. But the Mesopotamians turned it into system. They bureaucratized it. They created formal structures around the informal practice of sharing food. They made the invisible visible through record-keeping, through religious ritual, through deliberate construction of obligation networks. They understood something that modern culture has partly forgotten and partly denies. That every meal shared creates obligation. That hospitality is never free. That eating together is a form of contract. Modern culture pretends that dinner invitations are casual, that declining is no big deal, that attendance creates no obligation beyond maybe bringing wine. But underneath the polite fictions, the old mechanisms still operate. The Mesopotamians were just more honest about it. They wrote it down. They kept records. They made explicit what modern culture leaves implicit. You ate my food. You owe me. I attended your feast. You'll attend mine. We're bound together through shared meals, through witnessed participation, through accumulation of obligations. As weeks pass and you attend more gatherings, you settle into the rhythm of urban feast culture. You learn to read the social signals. You learn which families are allied, who's feuding with whom, where the power centers are. You learn by watching, by listening, by participating in the endless cycle of shared meals that constitute social life. The feasts blend together in memory. Individual meals become indistinguishable, but certain moments remain distinct. The boundary dispute, the coming-of-age ceremony. These moments stick because they illustrate principles, because they teach lessons about how the system works. You're becoming Mesopotamian. Slowly, through accumulation of shared meals and witnessed obligations. Your initial foreignness is fading. People are learning to recognize you. You're being integrated into the community one feast at a time. Late one evening, after yet another neighborhood feast, you sit alone, thinking about what you've learned, about the whispered rituals that give this entire experience its character. The rituals weren't loud or dramatic. They weren't the chanting priests or formal ceremonies. They were the quiet negotiations, the subtle signals, the unspoken agreements that happened in the spaces between official proceedings. The whisper, when someone indicated which family was looking for marriage partners. The quiet aside where obligation was acknowledged. The subtle shift in seating that signaled a dispute being resolved. The careful avoidance of certain topics. The knowing glance when someone behaved inappropriately. These were the real rituals. These were the mechanisms that made the system work. Not the dramatic moments, but the subtle ones. Not the official ceremonies, but the informal negotiations. Not what was said loudly, but what was communicated quietly. You think about the future, about the feasts that will happen after you're gone. The specific people will change. The specific disputes will be different. The marriages being negotiated will involve different families. But the structure will remain. The feast, as social technology, will persist because it works. Thousands of years from now, you imagine, people will still gather to eat together. They'll still use meals as context for conducting social business. They'll still create obligations through shared food. They'll still negotiate marriages and resolve disputes while breaking bread together. The details will change. The technology will advance. But the fundamental human need to mark important moments with communal meals, that will remain. As you drift toward sleep, you hear faint sounds from nearby courtyards. Grinding stones. Always grinding stones. Someone preparing grain for tomorrow's bread. The sound is familiar now, comforting in its constancy. The grinding continues. The bread will be made. The feasts will happen. The obligations will accumulate. The whispered rituals will bind people together. This is civilization. Not the monuments or the laws. But this, the feast, the gathering, the slow, patient construction of social order through thousands of shared meals, the whispered agreements and quiet negotiations that convert strangers into neighbors, neighbors into community. The grinding stones fall silent. Someone has prepared enough flour for now. Tomorrow the work begins again. Tomorrow there will be more obligations, more gatherings, more food to share, more bonds to create. The cycle continues. The feast endures, one meal at a time, one obligation at a time, one whispered agreement at a time. Months have passed since you first attended the great temple feast that introduced you to the rhythms of Mesopotamian communal life. You've become part of the cycle now. The endless rotation of preparation and attendance, of obligation incurred and obligation fulfilled, of meals shared and bonds created that make urban existence possible. The seasons have turned. The barley has been harvested, threshed, stored in the great temple granaries that hold the city's survival through winter and possible drought. The date palms have fruited, their sweet produce carefully rationed and preserved. The rivers have flooded and receded, depositing new silt on the fields, renewing the soil that makes agriculture possible in this harsh landscape. And through it all, the feasts have continued. Not just the great temple feasts that happen a few times per year, but the smaller neighborhood gatherings that occur monthly. The family celebrations that mark births and deaths and coming-of-age ceremonies. The dispute resolutions and marriage negotiations and business partnerships that require the witness of communal meals. You've attended so many feasts now that you can no longer remember them individually. They blur together into a general impression of sitting on hard ground, eating bread and fish and lentils, drinking beer while navigating the complex social requirements of each gathering. But the pattern is clear. The structure is visible. You understand now what you couldn't grasp when you first arrived. The feast is how 40,000 people live together without killing each other. It's that simple and that profound. Without the feast, without the constant reinforcement of social bonds and obligations, without the public performance of hierarchy and reciprocity, the city would collapse. Not immediately, but gradually, as disputes escalated into feuds, as marriages failed to create alliances, as obligations went unfulfilled and trust eroded. The feast is the social glue. The feast is the operating system. The feast is the price of civilization. You've begun planning your own feast. Not because you want to, because you must. The obligations you've accumulated over months of attendance have reached the point where reciprocation can no longer be delayed. The families whose hospitality you've enjoyed, the neighbors who've witnessed your participation in communal life, the acquaintances who've included you in their social networks, all of them are waiting, watching, wondering when you'll fulfill your end of the bargain. The planning creates anxiety that sits in your stomach like undigested bread. How much food will you need? How many people must you invite? How much beer should you brew? The calculations seem impossible. Too little, and you'll be marked as stingy, as someone who takes more than they give. Too much, and you'll waste resources you can barely afford. You consult with older neighbors who've hosted many feasts. They provide guidance in that indirect way that characterizes all teaching here. They don't tell you exactly what to do. That would be presumptuous. But they share stories about their own feasts, about what worked and what didn't, about the delicate balance between adequate hospitality and excessive display. Slowly, aplanimerhis, you'll host a moderate gathering. Nothing elaborate that might seem like showing off, but nothing skimpy that might suggest poverty or lack of generosity. Perhaps 40 people. Perhaps 2 large jars of beer. Perhaps enough bread and fish to ensure everyone eats adequately without enormous surplus. The preparation begins 3 days before your feast. You've watched this process often enough to know what's required. But doing it yourself is different. The grinding seems to take forever. Your arms ache after just an hour of pushing grain between stones. And you have hours more ahead of you. This is why women who grind grain every day develop such strong shoulders. Such endurance for repetitive work. The beer brewing is equally challenging. You started the process a week ago, following the instructions of Ninsun, who agreed to advise you in exchange for a small portion of your grain stores. The fermenting jars sit in a cool corner of your dwelling, bubbling gently, transforming barley and dates into the liquid that will make or break your feast. Every few hours you check the beer, tasting it nervously, trying to distinguish between good fermentation and the beginnings of spoilage that would turn your entire batch toxic. The responsibility is terrifying. One mistake and you could poison your guests, destroy your reputation, end your social integration into this community you've worked so hard to join. But the beer tastes good, slightly sweet from the dates, with that distinctive barley flavor that everyone here finds comforting. Ninsun samples it and nods approval. You've done well. The beer will be adequate. Not the best beer anyone's tasted, but acceptable for a first-time host still learning the craft. The day of your feast arrives. You're awake before dawn, unable to sleep from anxiety. The bread needs to be baked. The fish needs to be collected from the fishermen who've agreed to supply you. The courtyard you've borrowed from a neighbor needs to be cleaned and arranged. 1,000 small tasks that all must be completed before guests begin arriving in late afternoon. By mid-morning, you're exhausted. By noon, you're wondering if you've made terrible mistakes in your calculations. By mid-afternoon, when guests begin arriving, you're too nervous to remember whether you've forgotten anything critical. But the feast proceeds. People arrive in the expected order. Families cluster in familiar patterns. The usual small talk fills the waiting period before food is served. You perform the required rituals, the prayers and offerings that acknowledge the god's role in providing food and community. Your hands shake slightly as you pour beer onto the ground for the goddess, hoping no one notices your nervousness. Then the eating begins. You've arranged for food to be served in appropriate order. Not strict hierarchy like at temple feasts. This is a neighborhood gathering where everyone is roughly equal status, but still with some acknowledgement of age and family size and social importance. The oldest eat first. Large families receive generous portions. Everyone else follows in patterns that feel natural, even if they're never explicitly stated. You can barely eat yourself. You're too busy watching to make sure everything proceeds smoothly. Is there enough beer? Is the fish fresh enough? Is the bread adequate? Do people seem satisfied or merely polite? The anxiety of hosting is far worse than the anxiety of attending. But people are eating. People are talking. The usual information exchange happens. Disputes are discussed. Marriages are mentioned. The irrigation problems are analyzed. Your feast is serving its purpose, providing the platform for social business to be conducted. As evening deepens and the feast gradually winds down, you realize something important. You've done it. You've fulfilled your obligations. You've demonstrated that you understand how the system works and that you can participate appropriately. You're no longer a newcomer. You're a member of the community, proven through the most fundamental test, the ability to host a feast that meets expectations. People thank you as they leave. Not effusively. That would be excessive. But with genuine acknowledgement that your hospitality was adequate, that your feast fulfilled its social function. You've created new obligations tonight. Of course, everyone who ate your food now owes you reciprocation. The cycle continues. But that's good. That's how it's supposed to work. You're now fully integrated into the web of mutual obligation that holds the city together. After the last guests depart, you sit alone in the borrowed courtyard, exhausted and satisfied in equal measure. The feast is over. The immediate anxiety is past. But you know this isn't the end. This is just one cycle in an endless rotation of feasts that will continue as long as the city exists. You think about the future, about feasts that will happen 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. The people will be different. The specific circumstances will change. But the fundamental pattern will remain because it works. Because humans need this structure, need these repeated performances of community and obligation, need the concrete experience of sitting together and eating together to maintain the abstract bonds that make civilization possible. The grinding stones start up somewhere in the distance. Someone preparing grain for tomorrow's bread. The sound that has become the soundtrack of your life here. Constant, rhythmic, endless. The sound of civilization maintaining itself through repetitive labor that produces the food that creates the feasts that generate the obligations that hold everything together. You stand slowly, your body aching from the day's exertions. Tomorrow you'll clean up the remnants of the feast. Tomorrow you'll return borrowed vessels and thank neighbors who helped with preparation. Tomorrow you'll begin the slow process of waiting for the next feast you're expected to attend. The next obligation you must fulfill. The next performance in the endless social theater that urban life requires. But tonight, you're satisfied. You've contributed to the great project of civilization. You've participated in the whispered rituals that convert individuals into community. You've helped maintain the social machinery that allows 40,000 people to live together in relative peace. This is what history is made of. Not the dramatic battles or the construction of monuments or the reigns of kings. But this, the feasts, the grinding, the beer brewing, the careful navigation of social obligations, the endless repetition of communal meals that somehow, mysteriously, create the bonds strong enough to hold entire civilizations together. As you walk home through dark streets, you think about all the people who've done this before you. Thousands of years of humans sitting together, eating together, creating obligations together, and thousands of years still to come. And people repeating these same patterns because nothing better has been invented for converting strangers into neighbors and neighbors into communities. The whispered rituals continue. The grinding stones never stop. The feasts proceed on their eternal schedule. And slowly, so slowly you barely notice it happening. Grain becomes flour, becomes bread, becomes feast, becomes obligation, becomes community, becomes civilization. One meal at a time. One obligation at a time. One whispered agreement at a time. Forever.